Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and a brand new video. In this week's video, we will be taking a look at how I built this DIY style planter box, and I'll take you through all of the steps in case you want to build this for yourself. This is a relatively quick and easy build, and all it took was 4 1x4x8 boards, so let's go ahead and get started. So I've got 4 cedar 1x4s from the big box store, and the first step we want to make is to cut all of these at 60 inches. Now you could just use the miter saw for this, obviously. I'm just using my crosscut sled because my miter saw station is tied up at the moment. But anyway, all we need to do is cut each of those 4 boards at 60 inches length and then glue those 4 boards together to make one big panel. Now cedar is relatively soft, so one trick that I like to do whenever I'm gluing panels up is to put some scrap pieces between the panel and the clamp to keep that clamp from digging into the sides, leaving an indentation on the panel. One sign of a good glue up is when you have squeeze out between the seams. Now if you're not going to be planing this down, you may want to wipe all that out. I'll be running this panel through the planer just to get rid of those glue seams, so if you don't have a bigger planer to do this, wipe those seams down, and then rather than running it through the planer, you can just sand everything smooth. After our panel is all smooth and cleaned up, we'll want to cut it right down the middle to give us 2 sections that are 30 inches long. And we will make the angle on this by marking 14 inches on the top and then 12 inches on the bottom, and then connect those with a straight edge, and we have our angle for this box. Now I'll be using my table saw to cut the angle, but if you'd rather do this on the miter saw, that will work perfectly fine. You just line the line up with the blade and then make that cut. Rather than the miter saw, it'll be much more accurate and easier to use the crosscut sled. And I realize that not everyone has a crosscut sled, so on the first half of this, I'll be using the miter gauge for this. So we match up our line with the slot within the table saw, then we can adjust the face of that miter gauge to match that, which will align the line that we drew up perfectly or very close to perfectly with the saw blade. After we have that first cut made, we'll just flip the board over, and then rather than making another measurement or trying to draw another line, we'll just slowly sneak up on the cut by sliding this panel a little bit over further each time until we finally cut all the excess off, leaving us with a perfectly shaped trapezoid. We want all 4 sides of our planter box to be exactly the same, so we'll use that first piece we cut out as a pattern, mark the line, and then using the miter gauge again, we can cut that other side, and those 2 pieces should line up exactly. If you do have a crosscut sled, you can do this entire process much quicker, first by cutting the angle on one side, flipping the board over, measuring 14 inches on the long side, and then cutting the first section of the panel out to its final shape. We can then use the gauge on the crosscut sled to mark the distance and make those repetitive cuts with ease. So regardless of whether you use the miter saw, the miter gauge, or the crosscut sled, you end up with 4 pieces, and you can assemble them like this to get a basic look at what this cedar planter box will look like. So everything looks good except for this odd angle that we created by cutting each of these panels at the angle. You can see that there's an overlay on the top and the bottom piece, and if we want to put a border around the top, which we will do, that won't work. So the very easy fix is to take some type of marker and mark the inside corner of each one of those panels. After we have those pieces marked, we need to find the angle that we had on either our miter gauge or the crosscut sled and tilt the table saw blade to the same exact angle. So I had about a 9.5 degree angle on that crosscut sled, so I tilt my table saw blade to that same angle. So the mark that we made on the inside of each of those panels will be cut off by the angle that we tilted the table saw blade to. So we'll put that mark we made down on the table saw facing into the blade, which will be the piece that's cut off at that angle. And after we cut off that side that has the mark on it, we can reassemble the box and see that the plane of each one of those panels matches up perfectly on the top and also the bottom, which is exactly what we're going for. So what we do on one side, we will need to do on the other. We're going to do the exact same thing on the bottom, except we're going to mark the outside of each panel rather than the inside. Once we have those marks, they will once again be facing downward on the table saw. You leave the fence in the exact same spot as it was, and you cut that angle off just like we did on the top part. So if you've done this step correctly, all of your angles now should line up in the same plane both on the front and the back side of this. We are going to keep the assembly of this planer box extremely simple. So I first put one piece down just to make sure that I have everything lined up in the proper direction. I'll then remove that bottom panel, put some glue on the side panels, and put the top piece on, which can be attached and secured in place using brad nails. I'm using 1 1/4 inch brad nails, and you could use screws or even regular nails here if you really wanted to. I just find using a brad nailer to be the most efficient method for this. If you happen to get any spring out like I did here, just grab a pair of snips, throw a cloth over it so that doesn't become a projectile when you snip it off, and just go ahead and cut those as flush as possible. The reason we don't need to be concerned about that spring out is because we'll be using the leftover pieces from the original cut and glue up to make some border trim pieces to cover up not only those brad nails but also the butt joint where those panels are glued together. So those leftover pieces we had were cross-cut to around 16 inches and ripped to 1 5/8 inches. You don't have to be exact with those measurements, just somewhere close. And then these pieces will be attached to the outside of the planer using glue and brad nails. Now we're going to do a trick here to make sure we don't see any brad nails. So we'll first put these trim pieces covering the seam on one side, clamp them in place, and then we'll flip the planer box over and attach them from the inside using brad nails. This way they'll be held securely in place with the glue and the brad nails, but because we use those brad nails on the inside, they'll never be seen from the outside. So on the adjacent side, you can see the brad nail holes where we originally put the panels together, but that's okay because we'll be using a trim piece on this side to cover up all of those brad nail holes. So those other side pieces are put on in the exact same manner. And one thing you'll want to remember is to leave all of these pieces long enough so you can cut them off with a flush cut saw. You certainly could try to measure them and make that compound angle cut before you attach them, but I think it's just easier to cut it off with a trim saw afterwards. The last part of the actual assembly is to put a border around the top to cover up those seams and the gaps. So I first flip the planer box over and measure the distance across the sides on opposite ends, cut those angles off at 45 degrees, and then just overlap those 45-degree angles on the other trim pieces in order to mark the angle and make the cut in the same manner. Now don't worry if your angles here don't all line up to 45. In fact, mine were off maybe a degree or so in each way. But that is okay because as long as your mitered corners match up, it doesn't necessarily matter what their angle is. So I use the crosscut sled to sneak up on the angle before making that cut to the exact length I needed it, and then this top border can just be glued in place and we will once again attach it to the top with brad nails. If you have any mismatched angles or slight overhangs where they shouldn't be, just grab the sander and sand everything down to where it somewhat looks flush. And then one last step that I like to do is to take a 1/4 inch round over bit and round over every surface angle that I can, which will not only soften all of those outside edges up, but give the planer box a much more complete look. For the finish, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure. There's tons of different options to use if you prefer not to use Rubio, as it is expensive, although I would say it does look absolutely fantastic on cedar. At this point, if you want to put a liner and some dirt in here, you would be able to do so. I think it's easier to just leave the plant in the pot and put it right down in there. So if you have a big pot, it should fit all the way down in there. If you have a smaller pot, you can put a couple brace pieces cut at the same angle to elevate that up off of the ground. Or to make it even more simple, you could just stack some scrap blocks right down on the bottom and set that pot on top of it. So that will wrap it up for this video. One thing I love about cedar is that I think the natural color goes good with just about everything, and honestly I wish I had more opportunities to work with cedar. So here are some final pictures. I hope you enjoyed the video and found the content useful. Let me know what you think of this build down in the comments, and if you have any questions, I'll be sure to answer those. So as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.